Too many individuals in this community already know a narrative of police violence, particularly the story of Firas Murad from the state of California, who was well known within this community and lost his life last year at the hands of violent police forces. Clearly, our nation's prison industrial complex is in need of drastic reform. Every individual in this room knows that. But apparently, so do the campaigners for president. Because as The Atlantic explained on April 12, 2016, candidates from across the aisle, ranging from Donald Trump to even Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders, agree that our nation needs rampant political reform of its prison and policing systems, if anything is actually to change. But they are forgetting one vital perspective, that of those incarcerated. Because as the NAACP's own website, last accessed half an hour ago, reported, black men in this country make up 12 to 13 demographically percent of the population, but 35 to 50% of our nation's prison demographics. If our nation is to have any hope of successfully changing its prison industrial complex trappings, it needs to reform its attempt at targeting these individuals. As a result, it is absolutely paramount that we answer the question: what steps must the United States take to bring an end to the mass incarceration of black men? The answer is that the United States must reform its system with widespread systemic overhaul if it's to even hope to begin to address the problem. Initially, by repealing mandatory minimum sentencing laws. Secondly, by ending its contracts with private prisons. And finally, by reforming and holding accountable its policing institutions. Everybody who's watched John Oliver in the room knows that mandatory minimums are terrible. However, mandatory minimums are terrible for particular populations, especially the black men who end up incarcerated far too often. That's the first way in which this systemic reform must occur. We must end our mandatory minimum sentencing laws. The New York Times explained on April 14, 2016, that the demographics largely targeted by these mandatory sentencing laws are those committing largely petty or drug theft-related crimes, usually more economically or situationally motivated. However, these economic and situation motivations usually apply to a particular demographic when it comes to sentencing in courts. Because as the New York Times explained on March 20th, 2016, those who are most largely sentenced by mandatory minimum laws are black men in America. White or predominantly wealthy people within the system obviously don't end up making it to the court system to begin with. It's clear that these laws are unfairly targeting a specific population, meaning that we can't reform our prison system if we're making sure that this targeting continues to exist. That's why we need to repeal these mandatory minimums entirely. Because as the Brookings Institution pointed out on April 2nd, 2016, Denver is itself considering removing these restrictions, and not only has the support of its black community, but research within the Denver community shows that doing so will not only put more black men back out into their communities where they belong, not in jail, but additionally will keep many of them from being sentenced to prison to begin with. It's clear that we need to reform these mandatory minimum laws if we're to begin actually addressing the problem of targeting at all. Mandatory minimums aren't even the initial step, though. Before they occur, we must actually address a problem wherein we are selling our prisoners to private organizations. That's the second way in which we must enact systemic overhaul if we're to hope to solve the problem, by repealing and getting rid of private prison ownership. As Forbes explained on August 3rd, 2015, private prison ownership is allowing many prisons essentially to target the most profitable demographic when it comes both to buying prisoners from other systems, additionally as to making sure these prisoners end up in their own prisons. And by targeting the most profitable demographic, it's clear that they're targeting black men. Because as the Journal for Criminality and Ethics reported in 2015, it's clear that black men make up such a large portion of the prison population, largely because so much is outsourced to these private prisons. So many prisoners who are already in the prison, and also who it is profitable for state police forces to end up arresting. It's clear that as long as there's profit coming from this situation, black men will be unfairly targeted, which is why this idea must be repealed. Because as the Washington Post explained on April 12, 2016, we cannot remain a civilized nation while we are continuing to gain money off of the backs of other individuals put into prison systems where they don't belong. Finally, The police are largely at the heart for why individuals end up in the system in the first place. We can essentially stop this problem at one of its many sources by making sure that this systemic reform makes sure that these police forces are held accountable for their actions. The Washington Post explained on April 3rd, 2016, that a number of police forces not only unfairly target black individuals, but additionally, because of a large rampant use of anabolic steroids within the police system, are so aggressive when it comes to arresting individuals that they're not actually making proper choices about whether or not people should be arrested, oftentimes battering them or forcing fights between themselves and the individuals being arrested that gets the individual who would not have otherwise been arrested. It becomes a cyclical problem in nature because, as the New York Times explained on April 14th, 2016, as long as anabolic steroids are around, making sure that these police aren't held accountable because they were technically chemically insane at the time, obviously the problem won't be solved and the police will continue to be violent. It's clear that we need to reform the police system by making sure that these police are held accountable because, as The Atlantic explained just 3 hours ago, when local communities start making sure that they're not only enforcing rules about anabolic steroids with their police, but also making sure to expel any police individuals who are engaging in violent techniques or unjust actions, not only can we make sure that this targeting is stopped at one of its many sources, but additionally, that no one else has to die unjustly at the hands of these monsters. It's clear that if we as a nation want to actually address prison reform, we need to start at its most pivotal point, the targeting of black individuals in America. So in returning to today's question, what steps must the United States take to bring an end to the mass incarceration of black men? There are many on a widespread systemic level. Repealing mandatory minimum laws, stopping outsourcing to private prisons, and making sure that at the end of the day, our police are accountable for their actions, so that lives like Firas Murad's didn't die in vain.